I can give up suffering very easily, but what about pleasure? Why would I want to give that up? The idea is that there is a higher pleasure, there's a more ultimate pleasure available when one goes within rather than seeks without. So really, this is the whole point here. It's not like you're giving up anything. You're simply discarding an inferior pleasure for a greater pleasure. Welcome back to Diary of Devotion's weekly study on the Bhagavad Gita. We're right in the thick of chapter 3, where Krishna is explaining to Arjuna the necessity of sacrifice in this life. He's also explained the consequences of not living in that way, of indulging uncontrollably in the sensual pleasures of life. But what's the point of living that regulated lifestyle? It's not to sit in that plane forever. It's to eventually go beyond the material modes of nature, to go beyond material suffering and pleasure. Now he's going to tell us a little bit about what it's like to actually achieve that. This is so important. We have to know that place to which we want to go in order to get there. Okay, let's begin. Om Ajnana Timirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurun militam yena tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. All right, we're beginning this week with chapter 3, text 17. Krishna says, "But for one who takes pleasure in the self, whose human life is one of self-realization, and who is satisfied in the self only, fully satiated, for him there is no duty." This is an important statement. Krishna has continuously told us the importance of doing one's prescribed duties. Remember, what is a prescribed duty? It's that which is right in the world. It's taking care of one's dependents. It's being an upstanding member of society. It's doing the right thing in all circumstances. This, however, is not the end in itself. The end is to go to a place of transcending material prescribed duties. And Krishna explains here that for one who's realized the self, no duties are left to be performed. What this means is that for that person, for that practitioner who attains even a little expertise in yoga, the satisfaction that comes from within is realized, rather than satisfaction from objects that are outside of the self. This inner satisfaction is so great, it's so all-pervading in the consciousness that Vishwanath Chakravarti asks the question, if one is satisfied in the self, would he be even a little bit satisfied in external objects? Obviously, the answer here is no. That internal satisfaction is so much greater, it's so much higher, and not only that, it's eternal. It has no end. It can't be taken away. And so Ramanuja, one of the great Vaishnavacharyas, describes such a person. He says, "For him who is satisfied by the self alone, and not by food, drink, and other things which are not the self, who rejoices in the self alone, and not in pleasure gardens, garlands of flowers, sweet-smelling things, singing and music, etc., and for whom everything, his subsistence, nourishment, and enjoyment, is the self alone. For him, nothing remains to be performed, because the essential nature of the self is perpetually within his vision." So we can see the ultimate purpose of these prescribed duties. It's not to get lost in those duties. It's not to become immersed in those things. It's to regulate the lifestyle such that we don't overindulge. And when we don't overindulge, we can more easily control the senses from reaching out to grab material things. And once the senses stop reaching out to grab material things, they begin more easily to turn inward and to find the pleasure within the self. But Krishna gives us a caveat here. In text 18, he says, "A self-realized man has no purpose to fulfill in the discharge of his prescribed duties, nor has he any reason not to perform such work, nor has he any need to depend on any other living being." You see, this is a very important distinction here. We're neither grabbing at material things, nor are we pushing them away. At first, many of us need to have a regulated lifestyle because our habit is to continually grab at pleasurable objects. However, the simple fact of the matter is, if we want to reach a transcendental consciousness, we can't push away material objects either. We have to be able to flow within material existence. And so from this verse, we can see that performing one's social responsibilities is at first necessary, especially for people like us who are so attached to the material world, but it's never the ultimate goal. For one who's attained the ultimate goal, which is realizing the self as a part and parcel of the Lord, performing or not performing one's social duties is entirely immaterial. That person neither clings to the roles of his temporary body nor rejects them. This person seeks neither notoriety nor infamy. He sits ultimately within the knowledge of the true self, that which lies within. External designations no longer have any control over him. And that ultimately is the result of performing actions without attachment to the results. And so why would we want to do that? Why would we want to give up material pleasure as well as material suffering? I can give up suffering very easily, but what about pleasure? Why would I want to give that up? The idea is that there is a higher pleasure, there's a more ultimate pleasure available when one goes within rather than seeks without. So really, this is the whole point here. It's not like you're giving up anything. You're simply discarding an inferior pleasure for a greater pleasure. Nothing can ever be lasting like that can be lasting. It's the ultimate truth. It's the ultimate pleasure, and it's fully satisfying. What is that ultimate pleasure? It's knowing that we are part and parcel of the Lord, abiding in a pure consciousness that's not contaminated by all the mind stuff that constantly kicks us around on a daily basis. Thoughts like, I'm better than that person, or I'm not good enough. This person loves me, that person hates me. All of that constant mind chatter, that judgment of the self and others, all of those things that fracture our consciousness. When we abide in pure awareness, that is the self, then we come to realize the beauty of everything around us. Richard Rohr said something interesting. He said, sit down and look at a single object for 10 minutes or more. Really get into the experience of seeing that thing. When you look at it long enough, its beauty begins to unfold in front of you like a flower. That's the power of concentration. That's the power of meditation. And that concentration, that is constitutive of the true core inner self. It's this fractured thinking, this constant chatter within the head that sends us in this direction and that direction, that breaks our consciousness. And that breaking of the consciousness from focusing on a single point brings anxiety. Okay, Krishna goes on in text 9, he says, therefore, without being attached to the fruits of activities, one should act as a matter of duty, for by working without attachment, one attains the Supreme. What is it to attain the Supreme? What does that mean? It means the realization that we are constantly in relationship with the Lord. We can't realize that when we're out there grasping at material things. We can only realize that when we detach ourselves from the temporary and place ourselves in the eternal. Material consciousness and God consciousness cannot exist at the same time. They're antithetical to one another. That's why the detachment piece is so important. We can't grab hold of the Lord while we're still holding on to material things like our bank accounts, our possessions, our pride, and so on. Okay, text 20, Krishna says, kings, such as Janak, attain perfection solely by performance of prescribed duties. Therefore, just for the sake of educating the people in general, you should perform your work. So Krishna is making a very important point here. He's bringing up King Janak, who was a historical king. He existed before Arjuna's time as an example for him to follow. Remember, Arjuna is not just any warrior. He's of the royal order. Krishna is trying to encourage Arjuna by saying that people of your same kind, people in your circumstance have attained perfection. And so similarly for us in our spiritual lives, it's so important to find association with people who are like us, people who are on the same spiritual path. I mean, I can hear countless examples of people who've attained God, but it's more encouraging when I hear about people like myself who are doing it. People like you have done this. We need only seek out those who've been down a similar path and can advise us properly. Okay, Krishna goes on, he says, whatever action a great man performs, common men follow, and whatever standards he sets by exemplary acts, all the world pursues. I mean, let's face it, most people are not philosophers. Most people don't think very deeply about what is or is not right action. This isn't particularly surprising. It's not even particularly troublesome when our leaders are good people, when they know the difference between right and wrong. If they have high moral standards, they set a good example for others to follow. Unfortunately, in our time, the lack of spiritual vision has induced most people, our leaders included, to think in terms of us and them, in terms of dualities. They look for the differences between people rather than the underlying sameness between themselves and all living beings. They see animals as something fundamentally different to themselves, so they have no qualms about killing them and eating them. They see people of other races as different and nearly alien to themselves, and therefore subject to exploitation. And so in the face of such a condition, what does the wise person do? The wise person does not lose heart to despair. Rather, cultivating equal vision toward all living beings, they become living examples of Dharma for others to follow. Okay, in text 22, Krishna says, O son of Pritha, Pritha is another name for Arjuna, there is no work prescribed for me within all the three planetary systems, nor am I in want of anything, nor have I a need to obtain anything, and yet I am engaged in prescribed duties. All of this makes sense. Krishna is the Supreme Lord. There's nothing he has to do. There's nothing he wants to get. He's the source of everything. And yet he says he's still engaged in prescribed duties. Why? Just to set an example. I mean, this is the wonderful thing about Dharma. We can always look to the Lord himself. The Lord is not so detached from the material world that he can't come close to our level and say, this is the correct mode of action. This is the correct way of being. And the Lord himself is an example that will never fail us. Okay, text 23. For if I failed to engage in carefully performing prescribed duties, O Partha, another name for Arjuna, certainly all men would follow my path. And he goes on, if I did not perform prescribed duties, all these worlds would be put to ruination. I would be the cause of creating unwanted population, and I would thereby destroy the peace of all living beings. So Krishna is really hitting it home here. He says that people will follow the actions of the people that they look up to. My children, my neighbors, my spouse. I mean, people are looking at us from every corner to see what kind of behavior we're modeling. So don't think the behavior of an ordinary person is any less important than the behavior of a great world leader. Okay, so what are our takeaways for today? Takeaway number 1 is that the pleasure that's found from within is so much greater than the pleasure that we get from without. Food, drugs, alcohol, relationships, none of it can compare. So even if we just have self-interest in mind, we should seek and cultivate the pleasure that comes from within. This is a pleasure that's never ending. It never has to be acquired from somewhere else, and it can never be taken away. And when we no longer have the anxiety of our pleasure being taken away, we nearly have no anxiety for anything. The only thing that's left is to conquer the anxiety of death. That will come later. Stay tuned for that. Okay, takeaway number 2. We need to find association with like-minded people, with people who are aiming for the highest thing. That association will take us so much higher on this path than we could ever go on our own. I mean, just think about it. When I try to do anything, if I have the association of people who are encouraging me, who are helping me along that path, I'm always going to go down that path with those people faster and easier than if I were doing it on my own. Takeaway number 3 is that setting an example is important. We no longer live in a time where we can look to our world leaders to set examples of behavior and goodness, so we have to embody that in ourselves. We have to look to the Lord and to other saintly people around us as examples to emulate. And then once we take that within our hearts, we can be living examples for other people to follow. Okay, thanks for sticking around to the end. If you have any thoughts or comments on this, put them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you next time. Jai Shri Radhe.